Well, hello. I'm coming to you today from the Cumberland Bunker near Monteagle, Tennessee. Have more to share about that at some other point. Say hello to Scarlett. This is our little mutt dog who's my companion when I come up here. When I was growing up, I would often hear my parents and their generation say, "Lord willing and the creek don't rise." The context would be, I'm going to do something, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise. And it wasn't until just a few years ago that I realized that the creek that they are talking about in that phrase was the Creek Indians, not a stream, not a moving body of water, but the Creek Indians. So since I retired from NASA, one of the things I've been kind of passionate about is the southern history, particularly Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia area. My parents grew up in the Alabama, Mississippi area, and their generation would often use that phrase, "Lord willing, the creek don't rise." So I wanted to learn a lot more about the rising creek that they were referring to and the history of that. So I read this book called A Brutal Reckoning. Andrew Jackson, The Creek Indians and the Epic War of the American South by Peter Cozzens, author of The Earth is Weeping. Really interesting book. And there's a few takeaways that I wanted to share. This past July 4th, Ben & Jerry made some news. Ben & Jerry Ice Cream made some news about giving back the land that was stolen from the natives. And there's some problems with that. There's this notion that all was peace and love before the Europeans got to North America, that the natives of North America, and in this particular case, the South, that they were all sitting around singing Kumbaya and had very distinct borders between them. And that is simply not the case. In the South, in Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, Mississippi area, you had the Cherokee Indians, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Creek. And the Creek, particularly their lands in the 1700s, were in modern-day Georgia and Alabama primarily. But these tribes, which were loose affiliations of families, would oftentimes encroach on each other's borders. And they would take slaves and intermarry and do pretty terrible, horrible things to each other. So all was not kumbaya. And if you had the notion that you were going to give back the land that the Europeans stole from the natives, from the Indians, if we want to call them that, at what point do you decide when the borders were? Because these natives were constantly moving the borders back and forth between each other, invading each other, and so forth, particularly if there were droughts or other issues with hunting lands and that kind of thing. So I think that that's a notion that we need to dispel. You got to decide at what point do we decide to set the borders if we are going to do that. So that's one of the takeaways that I had from this book. Another takeaway is just how brutal both sides were with each other. And the Creek Indian Wars in the early 1800s were predicated on the notion that the natives were encroaching on the Europeans' land, and of course the Europeans were on the Native Americans' land, and so Andrew Jackson, he mustered some troops, including Davy Crockett, in the area where I live in Fayetteville, Tennessee, and they went down into Alabama, and they had some friendly Cherokee go with them. And they also had some friendly Creek that joined them, and they eventually brought down the Red Sticks, as they were called. Interestingly enough, Baton Rouge, Louisiana is French for Red Sticks. So the Red Sticks were the native creeks that were had decided to have an uprising and tried to push back the Europeans as they moved their way from Tennessee and Georgia into Alabama. And Alabama was still pretty wild by the early 1800s. So it's interesting history. Now when I use the phrase that I'm going to do something, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise, I understand what creek we're exactly talking about. So I guess I'll leave it with that, and more to come on that era, because it's a time before the Civil War, and before things kind of got out of hand and resulted in the war between the states. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, the South was still the wild frontier, and that's an interesting time of history. If you haven't already, I hope you'll subscribe to my channel. I'm going to do more discussions on the history of the South, particularly the Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia area in the coming weeks and months. It is a subject that I'm really, really fascinated with, and something that I think is of interest to you. So hit that subscribe button, and when I post a new one, you'll get notice right away. Take care. Thanks.